Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Bobbi Fisher. Joe has the day off today. Our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. Today, I'm actually going to read a story called Christmas in the Continental Army in 1776. So this is not our regular type podcast. We're going to keep it in the Christmas and holiday time period. So Christmas in the Continental Army in 1776. Congress created the Continental Army on June 14, 1775, and John Adams nominated George Washington to serve as the Army's commander-in-chief, and he was unanimously approved as such. The Continental Army consisted of soldiers from all 13 colonies, and after 1776, all 13 states. The earliest soldiers were volunteers with either no military experience at all or some colonial militia experience, as the new United States had no standing army. The public was generally against having a standing army in the colonies, but as the war progressed beyond the early battles of 1775, it became necessary to organize the Continental Army and to establish various departments to gather equipment, clothing, and other supplies needed. Keep in mind that the governing body at the beginning of the Revolutionary War was the Continental Congress, and that there was no official government organization for the new United States until the Articles of Confederation were finalized in November 1777. Even then, the Articles of Confederation were not ratified by all of the states until March 1781, and that was close to the end of the actual war itself. So the Continental Congress essentially followed the Articles as it conducted the Revolutionary War, even though they weren't official yet. The Articles created a very weak central government with a one-house Congress, no central leader, and no taxation power. So conducting a major war was a monumental task, as the Continental Army had to depend on the individual states to fund it, and that caused many disputes among the states. In addition to a weak national government, throughout its existence, the Continental Army was troubled by poor logistics, inadequate training, short-term enlistments, interstate rivalries, and Congress's inability to compel the states to provide food, money, or supplies. In the beginning, soldiers enlisted for a year, largely motivated by patriotism. But as the war dragged on, bounties and other incentives became more commonplace. Major and minor mutinies, 56 in all, diminished the reliability of two of the main units by late in the war. The Army increased its effectiveness and success rate through a series of trials and errors, often at a great human cost. George Washington and other distinguished officers were instrumental leaders in preserving unity, learning and adapting, and ensuring discipline throughout the 8 years of the war. In the winter of 1777-1778, Washington brought in a few accomplished military leaders from several European countries to finally help train soldiers and plan battles. But let's go back a little bit. By late 1776, the Continental Army had not been very successful, and General George Washington knew that morale was low because the Americans had not had any real success, and there had been a lot of desertion. Washington expressed some doubts. Writing to his cousin in Virginia, he said, quote, "I think the game is pretty near up," end quote. To try and end the year on a high note, Washington devised a plan to cross the icy Delaware River on the night of December 25th, 26th, 1776, to surround the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. Hessians were mercenaries or paid soldiers that had been hired by the British. Hesse was an area that is in modern-day Germany. They were hired by the British to fight for them against the Americans. Washington's aim was to conduct a surprise attack upon a Hessian garrison of roughly 1,400 soldiers located in and around Trenton, New Jersey. Washington hoped that a quick victory at Trenton would bolster sagging morale in his army and encourage more men to join the ranks of the Continentals come the new year. After several councils of war, General Washington set the date for the river crossing for Christmas night, 1776. He figured that the night of Christmas would be perfect because the Hessians would not expect an attack on the Christmas holiday. Although disputed among historians, it is said that Washington also knew that the Hessians were big drinkers, and he figured they would be drinking a lot since they wouldn't be expecting an attack on Christmas. There is no known evidence that this is the case, but it does make for a good story. Washington's plan of attack included 3 different crossings of the Delaware River on Christmas night. Colonel Cadwalader was to lead his force of 1,200 Philadelphia militia and 600 Continentals across the river near Burlington, New Jersey. His role was to harass and prevent the British and Hessian units near the town from racing north to support the Hessians at Trenton. General James Ewing's force of 800 Pennsylvania militia was to cross the river at Trenton and take up defensive positions along the Assunpink River and bridge. Ewing's soldiers would work to prevent the Hessians from retreating from Trenton, and Washington and his 2,400 soldiers would cross at McConkey's and Johnson's ferries, roughly 10 miles north of Trenton, and would then march down to Trenton to surprise the garrison at dawn. This was an ambitious plan, one that even well-rested and experienced troops would have had difficulty in executing. Both Cadwalader and Ewing's forces were unable to cross the ice-choked river, and Washington's main force managed a crossing, but it was delayed by more than 3 hours. Thanks to the foresight of General Washington and the actions of the New Jersey militia, the American forces had brought all available watercraft on the Delaware to the southern bank, thus denying the British the use of these crafts, while making them available for an American recrossing. Much of Washington's force crossed the river in shallow draft Durham boats, which were strongly built cargo vessels, most between 40 and 60 feet in length, designed to move iron ore and bulk goods down the river to markets in and around Philadelphia. These stout craft with their high sidewalls were robust enough to survive the ice-choked Delaware. Heavy artillery pieces and horses were transported on large flat-bottomed ferries and other watercraft more suited to carrying that type of difficult cargo. It shouldn't be surprising that most of Washington's soldiers stood during the crossing, since the bottoms of Durham boats were neither comfortable nor dry. One factor in Washington's favor was the large number of experienced watermen to be found at the crossing site. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment was filled with New Englanders who had extensive experience as seamen. Glover's men were all quite identifiable with their short blue seaman's jackets, tarred pants, and woolen caps. Other experienced watermen from the Philadelphia area, many familiar with this exact stretch of river, had also congregated in the area and were able to provide the muscle and skill needed to make the perilous nighttime crossing. By the time that most of the soldiers had reached the launching point for the boats, the drizzle had turned into a driving rain, and by 11 o'clock that evening, while the boats were crossing the river, a howling nor'easter made the miserable crossing even worse. One soldier recorded that, quote, "it blew a perfect hurricane," end quote, as snow and sleet lashed Washington's army. It shouldn't be all that surprising that Washington's carefully choreographed attack plan should have fallen so far behind schedule. His men were tired, hungry, and ill-clothed. They had to march many miles through the dark and snow to even reach the river crossing site. From there, they needed to board boats at night during a frightening nor'easter. Finally, across the river, Washington was dismayed to discover that he was so far behind his schedule. His plan had called for another march of 10 miles to the outskirts of Trenton on roads that were now slick with ice and snow. With every delay, Washington's fears that his army would be caught in the open magnified. What to do? Contemplating his choices, Washington was seen brooding on a crate near a fire. Washington later wrote, when remembering this fateful moment, quote, "As I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered and harassed on repassing the river, I determined to push on at all events," end quote. One would think that crossing an icy river at night was hard enough without also bringing a great contingent of heavy artillery pieces with them. Despite the trouble, Washington and the Continental Army wanted the extra firepower that the artillery could produce. Under the overall command of Colonel Henry Knox, The Continentals brought 18 cannons over the river, 3-pounders, 4-pounders, and some 6-pounders, horses to pull the carriages, and enough ammunition for the coming battle. The 6-pounders, weighing as much as 1,750 pounds each, were the most difficult to transport to the far side of the river. But in the end, all of the trouble of moving this large artillery train to Trenton proved its worth. Knox would place the bulk of his artillery at the top of the town, where its fire commanded the center of Trenton. Despite how the Delaware River is commonly portrayed in works of art, the site where General Washington and his army crossed was rather narrow. With 2 detachments unable to cross the river, that left Washington with only the 2,400 men under his command in the assault, 3,000 fewer than planned. The army marched 9 miles south to Trenton in about 4 hours' time. The Hessians had lowered their guard, thinking they were safe from the Americans' army, and they had no long-distance outposts or patrols. Washington's forces caught them off guard, and after a short but fierce resistance, most of the Hessians surrendered and were captured, with just over a third escaping across Assunpink Creek, which is a tributary of the Delaware River. Despite the battle's small numbers, the victory inspired patriots and sympathizers of the newly formed United States. With the success of the ongoing revolution in doubt a week earlier, and the army seeming on the verge of collapse, this dramatic Christmas victory inspired soldiers to believe the war was not a lost cause, and to serve longer. It also attracted new recruits to the ranks. Washington's victory, although small in comparison to most major battles, probably enabled the Americans to successfully continue to fight for their independence against the British. I want to take a couple minutes to talk about the famous painting. Probably most of you have seen the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. It was painted in 1851 by German artist Emanuel Luzzi, who painted the famous painting in Dusseldorf, Germany. It became a sensation on both sides of the Atlantic. Washington crossing the Delaware shows a bold General Washington navigating through the frozen river, with his compatriots braving the elements on their way to victory at Trenton. In the fall of 1851, the painting was shipped to the United States, where it wowed audiences in New York City and in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. The New York Evening Mirror boldly called it, quote, the grandest, most majestic, and most effective painting ever exhibited in America, end quote. It is now on display in the American Gallery at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It's estimated that at the time of Washington crossing the Delaware, temperatures were probably around 29 to 33 degrees, with brisk winds coming out of the northeast along with the sleet and snow. Also, future U.S. President James Monroe, who was around 20 years old, crossed with the American forces and was actually wounded at the Battle of Trenton. Washington chose the challenge or countersign of victory or death for his forces who crossed the river. George Washington was 44 years old at the time of the Delaware River crossing. So that concludes our Christmas story of Washington crossing the Delaware. Our first new episode of Season 2 of Plain Civics will be a second Say What episode, where I answer or explain a few more common misconceptions about our government and the Constitution. So stay tuned for our upcoming new season. That's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works, so you can make the government work for you.